And thank you to all of you who are joining us in such huge numbers for our inaugural Indie List session. This is the first time that we've gotten together since this little baby was born. So my name is Una Herlihy. My partner in crime is here with me, Peter McPartlin, and we are both extremely grateful for all the support that we've gotten in the last 3 months while we've been setting up the Indie List. We now have nearly 400 people. Like, we're just blown away. We've nearly 400 people who've signed up. We've probably put about 60 people into jobs. We're getting more and more inquiries every single day. So we really feel that we have hit a very rich theme, and we want to thank you all for joining us and being part of this community. So look, as two self-employed individuals, we know that choosing the freelance life gives great freedom and great flexibility, but it's not without its challenges. It can sometimes be a very lonely road, and sometimes networking is really hard, and so you have to be quite tough and resilient, and we have learned that the hard way. So that is precisely why we have set up the Indie List. We're creating a place where people can get work, absolutely, but also we want to create a place where you can network, where you can learn, where you can collaborate, and also kind of feel part of a community of like-minded individuals. As somebody who's been freelance for so long, I used to kind of get really sort of upset that we didn't even have a blooming Christmas party. So this is our first get together. Hopefully we'll be able to meet in real life fairly soon. Just a bit of housekeeping, folks. As I admit a few more people, sorry, admit all. Can you please put your mics on mute? And if you have any questions of our distinguished guests, please put them in the chat box, and we will try to get to them during the course of the conversation. So, without further ado, it is time to introduce you to our guest speakers. So, number one, a very warm welcome to Paul Dervan, CMO of the National Lottery and author of Run with Foxes. So, very interesting read. And a Céad Míle Fáilte to Jon Younger, who, as he describes himself as the Forrest Gump of writing. Jon is a HR consultant, author, and global expert on the future of work and the freelance revolution, dialing in from New York City. And very welcome to you both, and thank you very much for being with us. So Jon, how's everything in New York?
You know, thank you for asking, because New York is my hometown, and I want you to know that the word that says everybody's leaving is not accurate. In fact, people are coming back because our numbers are very, very good. I think we're at 0.5, which means we're about the safest place in the United States right now.
Really?
And absolutely. And we're having trouble with the schools, just like everybody else around the world. It's do we send them to school? Do we do hybrids, et cetera, et cetera? So it's a mess.
Yeah.
But in the educational area, we're worried that people are starting to come back to work and maybe coming back to work too soon. But all in, when you come to my neighborhood, which is the east side of Manhattan,
Nice.
it almost feels like we're back to normal. People are walking, they're laughing. You see the masks and people socially distance, but there is a sense of optimism in New York, which
That's
is
great.
really, really terrific.
That's
Really
great.
terrific.
That's great. Well, look,
Thanks for
Jon,
asking.
you're so welcome, and thank you very much for your time today. Look, one of the interesting things that we have been discovering in our research about freelance, the freelance revolution, a really interesting statistic that we read was that within 7 years from now, about 50% of the workforce from the US would be freelance. What is going on? Why are so many people crazy about freelance?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and it's what I would call a fat question, and I'll be interested in the exchange with Paul and with others around this stuff as well. But I can give you a couple of statistics that sort of bring us back to reality. Upwork just published some data, I think, that said 57% of the US would be some form of freelancing. When they say that, they're throwing a whole bunch of categories together. They're putting in the TaskRabbit people with the AI and machine learning and robotics professionals. They're talking about both part-time people, what we call side giggers, people who are doing it although they have a full-time job, and people who are doing it full-time as well. To the best of our ability to define this, and it's a very squeaky statistic, we think that there are about 160 million people in the world who are doing some form of freelancing. That is to say, they're either doing it part-time or they're doing it full-time. Within the US, what you would see, to the best of my knowledge, is about 20 million people, not 100 million people, 20 million people who are pretty much full-time in freelancing, and then many, many others who fall in a number of categories, from people who are in between jobs and doing it to make ends meet, people who are doing it part-time to save a little money for university or a holiday, people who are doing it, they're called passionistas, and these are people that just love what they do. It's the craft that they love. I have a dear friend in Denmark that started something called Farm Charm because she, as you, loves living in the country and wanted to bring some of that using a website to do that. So I think overall what you're seeing is there's continuing growth. The growth is not as sensational as the numbers suggest, but there's clearly a move long term for more people to be full-time or significant side giggers than ever before.
And why is that?
Well, I think it's three or four things. One is there's a need, right? Many people have lost their jobs. Second is that many people are not happy or distrusting of organizations. Third, I think you'd find that many people really have gotten the entrepreneurial bug. And in many ways, all of us, one other term for freelancer is solopreneur.
Yeah.
Right? A person who is running their own business, but as the single employee. And then there's another dimension, and it's a sad one, and that is that an awful lot of people have come into the States and many other countries without skills. And many of those people have been forced, as technology automates some of the low skill work, people have been forced to move into gigster type work to organize enough of an income to keep their families safe.
Okay.
Those seem to be the principal reasons.
Right.
Paul, what would you add to that here in Ireland?
Hi guys. Hi Una, John.
How you?
And I recognize some folks as well. Good to see you guys. I don't know, like like Una, presumably the reason why you asked me to come along is because I have, tried to work with freelancers for a long time. Most of my background is actually client side, although I do a little freelancing myself. I've been mostly on the side of looking for people to help, even when there's lots of options which don't include freelancers. So I guess I have a personal view, which is, it's like everyone else has got bias and all sorts of other things built into it. I think it's interesting. I think people choose freelancing or fall into freelancing for a number of reasons, but one of the things what I find fascinating, and my background is in marketing and working with a range of people, from everything from creatives, and I see some of them here today, and like people who work in account management or project management or UX UI and all those things. And I think part of why I've been attracted to working with freelancers is the model, and it's probably dysfunctional because it's probably trying to deal with a lot of the difficulties that arise between clients and agencies anyway, and a lot of them are like you build in things to cater for client misunderstandings of how things actually work, and in doing so you just add layers, and it's certainly been my experience that if you can find ways to cut through those layers, you can actually find yourself working with incredible people who add the real value. And it doesn't always work, as in not every client is able to do that. And but certainly, I've tried numerous models throughout the years, and I still do. And I some of the best stuff I've been involved with has involved freelancers, to be honest with you.
And Paul, I suppose you're kind of famous, or maybe infamous is probably a better word, for like kind of breaking the model, and finding ways around the barriers. And I think in your previous role in Indeed, you exclusively worked with freelancers, and now in your role with the National Lottery, you're working with a combination of freelancers and your agencies. So I guess the question is, how do you make that work, and why do you bring the freelancers in? What role do they play for you in keeping work moving and fresh and relevant?
I think it's different every time. Like Indeed was interesting. Like as a marketing concept, Indeed, our budgets were about 400 million. Like we were making a lot of stuff with a lot of markets, and we actually, by the time I left, we had a hybrid model where we had built an in-house full-time team, but we worked with numerous freelancers across different countries. But I would say one thing, like it's not that I go out of my way to break things, but I do believe that there's an important distinction, which is I don't think freelancing should be equated to transactional, and I think that's really important. At least in my world, if I look at the last 10 years, a lot of the people I work with, I've been working with on an ongoing basis throughout the years, and I've had a chance I would work with them again. And like I saw a Mel here on here today, and I saw Jude on here today, and they're both outstanding individuals who I've had a chance to work with in the past. And I know that Jude is as far as I know, is freelancing or working out in his own, and Mel similarly. And knowing these people and knowing who they are and knowing when an opportunity comes up is important for me. And so I really think it's important that it isn't seen as transactional, because I think it's really hard to do good marketing in a transactional way.
Yeah, well, that's kind of interesting, and I wouldn't mind talking about that later on in terms of like the skills that are required of people to form those partnerships that are less transactional and more sort of relationship based. But maybe just before we go down that route, what I'd like to kind of understand really is, in terms of COVID, and maybe John, I might kind of come back to you here, just before we kind of go into talk about COVID. You just talk to us a little bit about the various platforms that you have experienced, that serve the freelance community, and talk to us a little bit about them.
Happy to. I want to. I wanted, before I do that, and I'm delighted to do that, I just want to put a bow on something that Paul said, which is very important, and make it very clear. Paul, when you use the word transactional, I think that's that's an alternative to saying sort of through the website or on the landing page, or going to an Upwork site or a freelancer site and buying somebody sort of off the shelf. And what's interesting about that is that if you take a look at the actual data, to Paul's comment, only 5 to 10% of all the freelancing that we're talking about actually goes through landing pages. 90% of it continues to transit through relationships, through experiences, such as Paul just described. What's really important about that is understanding that as a freelancer, some of the folks that are not as sophisticated join a platform and then wait for the work. It doesn't come. If you go to and I want to give people some context around this, if I may, Una, because I think it will
Yes.
be helpful as you guys expand and grow in your freelancing stuff. Um, if you take a look at the number of people on some of these sites, Upwork has 20 million people. Freelancer.com has 44 million people on its website. It's larger than the country of Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
So when you think about, and Fiverr has, I don't know, about 10 or 15 million. I mean, these are large sites. What that means for a person signing up on Upwork, which is the best known of these sites, less than 4% of the people on Upwork get any business at all. No business at all. 96% of the people don't get work. If you go to something like Patreon, which is very much of a sort of a global creative site, and I love the Fall of Civilization series, so I pay $3 a month for this fellow in the UK who just does these fabulous historical movies. But only 3% of the people at Patreon get work. So really important for people to understand, that, to Paul's comment, that not only is a transactional bias not a particularly productive thing to be thinking about, but no matter how many sites you're on, whether you're on Indie List or any other list, you still have the same responsibilities as any business person, which is to have a clear strategy, have a clear marketing plan, reach out to customers, provide excellent service, et cetera, et cetera. There are about 800 of these freelance sites around the world, and they are growing in every country and in every region. But the requirement remains that even though you may get some work over the transom, most of the responsibility for freelancers to get work is theirs.
Yeah, the way we say it, John, is that there's a big onus on the talent themselves to put themselves in danger of finding work, and
There you
that's,
go.
well, like people who are kind of contacting us all the time saying, here's some new work we've done. It's a great way to keep even top of mind for us. So that's, I think, a big kind of call out that we would say to our community here is to don't be shy, to tell us what you're doing,
Yes.
and to share the work, and then we can kind of keep you top of mind with the clients that are coming to us.
Exactly.
That's a great piece of advice, John. So, like in terms of, obviously COVID has thrown the world upside down, right, and into chaos. And for us here in Ireland, we're also looking at the economic impact of a hard Brexit. So that's likely going to be really difficult for us. So how do you think this is going to change how employers think about their workforce? And is this going to play into the hands of freelancers?
I think so, and I'll give you my version of this for what it's worth. There are several reasons why freelancing will grow as a result of COVID for the short and medium term, and who knows what the long term looks like. But for the short and medium term, there are several things going on that are helpful to freelancers. Some freelancers, not all freelancers, and that's an important distinction. So one is that as people have had to go remote, think about this, folks, for a second. The difference between a remote employee and a freelancer gets very small, very small. And so one of the things that's happened as a result of people having to go through lockdowns, shelter in place, et cetera, and now 50% of people, at least in the US, are reluctant to think about going back to work. That creates an opportunity for freelancers. And it does, because it's not much different to work with a freelancer than to work with somebody who is working remotely, working on a distributed basis, etc. Second, money's tight. The economy in the US, as an example, will fall by about 3 or 4%. The economy in the UK, which is your neighbor, will fall between 4 and 6%. I don't know about Ireland, but we know that as a result of that, companies are pinching their pennies.
Yeah.
The opportunity to work on an on-demand basis is attractive versus a full-time basis. Many companies that are good companies, good organizations, are reluctant to hire because they don't see the future and they don't want to hurt people. They don't want to hire and then furlough.
Mm. Mm.
Freelancers offer an opportunity to avoid that. And third, the world is changing so fast that the skills that are required are also changing so fast. And I know we're going to talk about skills a bit later,
Mm.
but as an example, um, there isn't a company in the world that I know of right now that wouldn't like access to some expertise around digital transformation.
Yeah.
Now, there aren't a lot of folks that do that. On the marketing and agency side, there are a lot of folks that understand, a lot of people that understand some parts of that, but they don't know the tech of that.
Yeah.
And so what we're experiencing between those three, uncertainty on the part of business, the creation of opportunity through remote, and the reality that skills are changing quickly, and as a result of that, there's opportunity for freelancers that have those skills that are high in demand for all of those reasons.
Yeah.
Now, the next question, Una, is, well, what happens when we have a vaccine? And
Yeah.
I believe that what's happened is that as the tech has matured, more people will work remotely. I think
Mm.
there's a real estate arbitrage that makes that attractive, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of the startups are going to be more open to that than some of the old economy companies.
Mm.
But I don't know that it's going to be the panacea that people describe. We'll have to see.
We'll have to see. Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting that we talk about those roles on our indie list at the moment. What we have is about a third of the people on our list would be what we would kind of call the traditional creative roles. So we have creative directors, copywriters, art directors, and so
Right.
on. And I mean, I think, Paul, maybe I might go to you for this question. First of all, like, how important do you think these skills are going to be from a marketing and communications perspective post-COVID, but also what are you seeing as the kind of some interesting in-demand roles emerging?
I think they're always going to be important. So the roles you mentioned, is it?
Yeah, so yeah, those craft roles.
Yeah, like they're valued in some places more than others, and I think that's but like that's always been the case, and I think it's important to that comes back down to John made the point about having your strategy, like who you try to align and position your services for is very, very important and difficult. Like the easy answer is try and create services that profitable brands that want to do good work, but sometimes you've got to manage, you have to eat at the same time, so you have to figure out what work do I do to make my reputation better, and what work do I do because I can, and it's less profitable, but it's doable. I mentioned, we talked about beforehand about understanding, and it's easy for me because I'm client side now, but I did do a stint when I was doing consulting, and like there's an ongoing, slightly off piece here, but there's an ongoing discussion in your brain about, should I do that piece of work because I feel like I can do better work than that? And I think they're valid questions, but I would say try and make those decisions based on the right things, not, for example, on ego.
So it's kind of like leave your ego on the table.
Well, yeah, no, like I think, we mentioned that freelance isn't about being transactional. Freelance certainly isn't about poor quality either. And like, and any, like, I think that has become stronger over time, that clients at all aspects of the business, like finance people, procurement, they all seem to understand that you can have heavyweight freelancers. And it doesn't mean anything less than, because they know that, take the agency world, a lot of people working behind the walls in the agency are actually on some sort of contract for the agency as well. Like it's so I think that's well understood at this stage. But the jobs you choose and the work you choose does come down to some extent of, to some extent on the positioning. Like, do you try and chase global work? Do you do you go after small businesses, which are much more price sensitive, but there's more
Yeah.
of them, and then do you decide I'm not going to do something for less than X amount, or do I work with people who I believe are upfront and honest and are good payers? And there's a whole
Yeah.
range,
Yeah.
and it is complex, I think, and
Yeah.
it's not easy. But I think there's a certain number of clients in Ireland, and again, I'm only one person, so it's hard to know. But I've worked in lots of other markets, and if you're good at what you do, if you've got a good craft and you know that you're good at it, I would try and I would try and find clients who have a desire for that, and you will find people who will go out of their way to find people strong at their craft. You
Mm.
asked me about a year ago, you asked me, listen, do you know any really strong, interesting strategy people?
Yeah.
And if you remember, I said, yeah, actually, there's some really phenomenal people I know in New York, but they're good at X, but they're not great at Y, but they're not cheap.
Hmm.
And you went, that's perfect. The client I'm working with wants exactly that. They want the best in the world. And as John would know, some of the best in the world from a creative perspective has originated from New York.
Yeah.
But I would also say that, and this might be it might be like a sign of good news, but I worked with X Wyden and Kennedy people and a whole range of other amazing creatives, but there was an Irish team that beat their work globally every time, and their work was being broadcast all over the US.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this isn't like this. Certainly, if you're good at what you do, and you're
Yeah.
good at what you do, you should pitch it against the best.
Yeah, great. And John, maybe just in terms of new roles we're seeing, which I guess are coming from a combination of developments in technology, but also now COVID, in terms of how the future of work, the changes in the future of work have been accelerated by this pandemic. What do you see as sort of some interesting roles in the marketing and communications arena that are emerging?
It's a great question, and I give a little bit of context around it before I
Please.
jump right into there.
Yeah.
So one of the things that is really interesting is kind of the way in which these platforms have developed. And when I talk about platforms, I would describe the indie list as a platform for freelancers.
Yeah.
There, there are sort of 4 or 5 big categories of work, and there's a little bit of mix and match. So the fact that you may be a former agency, former creative, shouldn't stop you from thinking about other ways to pitch yourself. I mean, what you've ultimately got is not an identity as much as a set of skills. And be open around some of that stuff. I'll give you an example. There are 4 or 5 big categories of freelancing that are ongoing. One is tech, and one of the dilemmas in tech is that the people on the tech side know all about the tech of digital transformation, the tech of marketing transformation and digital marketing, but they may not have, and very often don't have, the the expertise on the marketing and marketing communication side. So one of the things that folks may be wanting to think about a little bit is how do you hook up with some of the tech stuff? So for example, there's an offer not only if you're a copywriter, the problem is you're looking for copywriting jobs.
Mm.
But if you're a copywriter that's also hooked up with a marketing transformation person and a strategy person and an SEO person, now you've got a business. You don't only have a skill, you have a business. And you're much more likely to be successful, if I may use the old expression, hunting in packs.
Mm.
Right? So that's the first thing. Second, um, there are a tremendous number of agency-related freelance freelance sites and platforms. One of the ones that I like very much is a platform called Hoxby. Hoxby is back in England, Hoxby. They have about 1,000 people, so it's much larger than yours. But they see themselves in a very similar way as part of a self-help and help one another community.
Yeah.
And so, for example, they don't hire out from outside the platform to do work on the platform, they hire their freelancers.
Yeah.
For example, they work together in groups, and there's a really nice sense in which they're helping one another to find jobs. So maybe very similar to what you're doing, but perhaps they have a few years ahead of you, and there's an opportunity to learn from some of their stuff. The other thing I would say is that if you're in marketing or marketing communication or PR, these are very, very competitive areas, but you might also think about aligning yourself with an independent management consulting platform, and there are many platforms that just as we've seen the deconstruction, if I may use it, of the agency, we've also seen the deconstruction of consultancies. And so many organizations many platforms are providing alternatives to the McKinsey, Bain, BCG, etc. And many of you folks have the skills to contribute directly and indirectly as part of those platforms as well, because so much of the transformation work is brand related, marketing related, communication related. And again, they may be excellent management consultants, but they don't have the communication and related brand building skills that are needed post opportunity. So one of the things that I would encourage people to do is not define themselves so narrowly, to Paul's point, that you're not looking at the opportunities to either side of you, the adjacencies, as management consultants would call them. I hope that's a helpful way to describe it.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we see globally and here to an increasing extent is the growth of in-house agencies. So clients taking a lot of the responsibility for their brand implementation in-house, and I think that's a growing area now. I think that if the the customers for freelancers are either agencies or client companies, I wonder what different types of skills are required for each of those particular kind of customer bases. Is there?
It's a great question, and I would add to that a couple of things. One is, we're seeing the same thing in management consulting. About a third of what's happening, let me use PwC as an example because it's an easy one and it's quite a large company. PwC is reducing its hiring of junior consultants by about a third. And the reason that it's reducing by about a third is because so many of the demands that clients are making of them are not for young MBAs. They're for people with 15 or 20 years of experience in a very particular area. It's trade lanes between Germany and India, as opposed to a new MBA that says, I'm pretty good around business strategy and operations. And so one of the ways that becomes very helpful for the folks here on the webinar is to say, contact these places. They are very open to talking with you about the kinds of skills that they need. They will help you to identify the kinds of skills that you need to describe yourself as containing and the level of that. And you may find that as you articulate those skills with these folks, and as IndieList works with some of those organizations, there's a lot more opportunity.
John, we have a question in here from one of our attendees, which is really about, I guess, the sort of mindset that you need to have to thrive as a freelancer, I guess, in today's challenging times. And maybe you might talk about that, because obviously being freelance isn't for everyone.
Sure. I think the first thing is you have to understand that you're a business person.
Yeah.
Regardless of the specific skill, the specific talent, the specific craft, at the end of the day, you are what we call a solopreneur. So, what does a solopreneur require? You need a clear understanding of the business that you're offering, and I'm going to restate some of what Paul has said. You need a clear understanding of who your customer is and what your target customer looks like and what your customer needs. There's a wonderful old saying among salespeople, and that is, if you can demonstrate to your customer that you understand what they need, what they want, they'll let you sell them what they need. So you've got the challenge of showing them not only do you have the specific skills that they need for this particular role, but you have a set of skills that really helps, that really enables you to have a good understanding of where they're going, what they need, how they need it, and with whom. The second piece is that you need, like any business, to have the fundamental systems in place. How are you collecting money? How are you budgeting? How are you thinking about your investments? What is it that you need in order to be successful? Where are you going to need it a year from now? Do you have the right kind of a computer? Do you have the right kind of a monitor? Are you on Calendly, whatever that.
Yeah, all these tools.
So that it's easy for people to get your time rather than difficult. Third, you've got to do a business review of yourself on a quarterly basis. How well positioned are you to get the kind of work that you want or you need? What relationships are critical in terms of doing that? How do you deal with your loneliness? Are you working with other people? Are you part of a network? Are you part of a meetup? How are you dealing with the emotional side of running a business during challenging times? Do you have, a very good understanding of where the market is headed? There's a wonderful expression for those of you that like hockey that describes Wayne Gretzky, Canada's greatest hockey player ever. And what they said was that he's not the best skater, he's not the best at shooting the puck, but he seems to be able to watch the whole game and see where the puck is going to be 30 seconds from now. Every one of us who are freelancing, do we know where the puck representing our business is going to be this year and next year? How demand is going to change? And are you future-proofing your skill set and your knowledge base so that you're in a position to play in that game the next year? That's a continuing thing. And I'll give you some data that says that about 2/3 of the folks that are freelancing have a game plan for the future proofing of their skills. And it turns out they're also the 2/3 of folks that are doing the best in terms of actually making money. So I'd ask, does everybody here have a plan for where they're headed, a plan for their core customer, a plan for how they're going to communicate to the marketplace what they bring to the party, a plan for how they're going to make sure that they have the skills that they need not only this year but next year, the information they need to plan their business, etc. And if you don't, work with others. This is a team sport.
Absolutely. And I think that's, part of the reason that we've set up this business. As a freelancer myself for 15 years, I used to find it really hard to justify investing in any kind of professional development because I used to think, I don't know where the next paycheck is coming from. But there are ways of increasing your learning through collaboration and networking with the right people. Jon, I have another question in here from Sinead. Do you think decision makers need education on how to effectively use freelance experts or specialists? Processes, pricing, utilization, and leveraging the skills available. Solo entrepreneurship for me is valuing specialist expertise rather than, in quotes, cheaper than an agency.
Again, I'm gonna take a little step back. Companies need to do, whether they're companies or they're governments, need to do 6 things well. And it's the obligation of freelancers together with platforms like the Indie List to help companies to do this. Think of it as a set of tests to see whether you'd like to make your biggest investment in that company, which is to give them your work. First thing a company needs is a clear strategy for how they're going to use freelancers. They need an understanding of whether freelancers are the last thing they're going to do, something that they're going to deal with on a regular basis, or it's going to be a part of their flexible blended workforce on an ongoing basis. So they need an idea of where they're going to play in the freelance business generally, what they're going to look for and how they're going to set up. Second, they need a good system of performance management. And what that means is clear objectives for the freelancer, clear milestones for success for freelancers, and ensuring two-way feedback, because it's important that freelancers get feedback on the performance that they're making, but it's also important that freelancers give feedback back to the companies, because they're not employees. They are partners. They're voluntary partners.
Yes.
Third, very important for organizations to train their managers to work effectively with freelancers. It's not the same. Paul sounds like a guy that really knows his stuff around this, but not everybody knows their stuff around working with freelancers, and it's easy to slip back into the belief that they're employees and they're not employees. Fourth, very important for organizations to treat them with the kind of team respect that makes them feel part of something, and not second-class citizens who can't go to the meeting, can't get the information, can't go to lunch with them, etc. Fifth, and I know I'm going fast, but you can read this stuff
okay.
by writing.
Yeah.
Fifth is companies need to be respectful of freelancers in terms of paying them fairly, paying them on time, making sure that there's not onerous bureaucracy. I remember some years ago being told by a company that they decided to save money by pushing back payment. I was a freelancer, and that once they got and agreed to the invoice, it would be 60 days.
Yeah.
And I said, so what you're really telling me is you're going to pay me once a quarter. I can't afford it. I'm leaving this.
Yeah.
Sixth and last, companies need to be smart and educated about the work that is appropriate for freelancers and the work that's not. Not because they don't have the skills, but because A, it may be an issue of liability, B, it may be an issue of IP, C, it may be that the background is so important that we can't give it to them sufficiently, etc.
Yeah.
So those 6 factors become the basis on which companies are either excellent partners with freelancers or they are treating them less well.
Yeah.
And my advice to IndieList and to each of the folks on the call is, don't forget that your participation, even though we all need the work, is voluntary, and you make a statement by the work that you take on, the companies that you take on the work with, and the way in which you're treated. Yeah. Expect to be treated like a fellow professional, a fellow business entrepreneur, a fellow craftsman and expert.
Well, actually, that's really interesting, John. We have one of our core values is around, comes from this notion that the free and freelancer kind of implies cheap, which of course in our world it doesn't. These are really, experienced people who have livelihoods to fund and, children's education to provide for, and so on and so forth. And, one of our questions, I suppose, was around the amount of people taking the freelance route. And actually one of our attendees today has kind of commented on this and has asked the question, given the state of work at the moment, I've noticed that the pricing of jobs are being reduced, and I'm afraid it will be a race to the bottom as we freelancers are pitted against each other. There's obviously a scarcity of work. The question really is there a value in saying no? And I think there probably is, but I'd love to get your view on this, what to do in this situation.
I want to respond, but I'd love to hear Paul's reaction to this as well, if you don't mind, just because he's on the buy side. Paul,
good one, yeah.
When a freelancer says, no, I won't work under those conditions or those terms, do you disrespect them, respect them, or is there something else?
Yeah, now, to be honest with you, that really isn't a situation that turns up for me. So in the sense that certainly when we're looking for people to help us do stuff, and a lot of the stuff we're trying to do is hard to pin down and describe. A lot of clients don't understand how you get to the end result. So it's not like build a wall. Do you know what I mean? It isn't it isn't widgets we're talking about here, at least in my world. And so anyone who I've worked with, Una knows this, and anyone I've worked with is I in every place I've worked and every marketing function that I've had an opportunity to either help lead or lead, if the strategy is we want to try and win in the marketplace with more effective communications and effective advertising, there's an underlying assumption there that stuff has to be paid for. And so, like, you won't get high quality work from anybody on a consistent basis if you're not willing to pay what they're worth. And so I rarely negotiate on those kind of things anyway, because if, like, usually the people I end up working with, I already know they're good. I've looked at their work. I've talked to people. I already understand they have the abilities and the skills and the previous work to do what I'm hoping they can do. And then I accept that they're people who spent 10, 20, 30 years building their craft, and of course they should be paid accordingly. And so I guess I really haven't had situations where people said, this is our price, and it hasn't been the appropriate price.
I think, from my own experience, as somebody who sometimes has been offered low money for the work that's required, or sometimes no money, I think, there are times that you have to negotiate, and there are other times when it just kind of feels like it's sort of taking advantage. I think you've got to sort of think long term about how you're going to form a relationship with a potential client and what might be further down the road. So I would say that sometimes there is a value.
But just on that does fall into, you know what, I'll do it cheap now and later on that'll come out well. And I think you have to understand the client. So if the client is upfront and says, I'm committing to a year's worth of work, can we negotiate like a price that seems fair over a year? Be very different to, why don't you do this at half price or a third less than you're saying, and maybe there's more work on the way, or exposure dollars as they call it. And I think that's bullshit. And I think that it's worthwhile, just in the same way that I would spend time trying to understand the people that I'm trying to work with. I would recommend anyone freelancing to do their diligence on their client, our potential client. And it doesn't take long, especially in Ireland. It's a small, you can find out very quickly the clients who are going to screw you, and the people who work with those clients. And sometimes it's by accident, as in they just don't respect that it takes a lot of time to write a short piece of copy. I see Bren is here on the call. Like, Bren is a wonderful copywriter who I've worked with many times. And like, if anyone came asking me like who's Bren, I'd say, yeah, he's great and he's expensive, and that would be my starting point.
Great.
And I
love that.
But I think it's important. It's important to I guess do your diligence on the person and understand, do they actually understand what's involved? And of course you can negotiate, and of course, basically the whole range of people I work on an ongoing basis, they always give me some sort of discount, but it isn't a hard negotiation. It's based on, do they believe that there is ongoing work for them? And it goes back to transactional. I know you mentioned Jon earlier on, is I can point to a handful of people who I would actively seek out across the world depending on the project.
Yes.
And none of them are cheap. But I know that they deliver, and I think this is the point that Jon was making earlier on. Like, to treat it like a business. There's an expectation. Like, if you ask the question, why do people not choose freelancers? Now that's an interesting question, and I think there's a couple of reasons. One is, and Jon was talking about this earlier on, is that I had at one stage when I worked in Indeed, I was working with, I think, 45 freelance designers and copywriters across the world, and what was difficult was the managing of all that. like the logistics of it, the like making sure they get paid promptly, reviewing the work, like a whole range of things that when you go to an established agency, they take that work off you, and so you pay as you should if someone's going to do that work for you. But so you have so as John mentioned, is a client set up to work with freelancers, they may not internally have the logistics to manage
Right.
all these different people and different things. So you that's partly why I think people don't go with freelance. And I think part of it also is they don't understand what's involved. So clients don't understand the whole range of pieces that are involved, and so you end up going, do you buy risk? Do
Yeah.
you do you de-risk it by going for an established, well branded agency or something like that? And
Yeah.
but I do think someone asked the question to John about education, and I do think the more you can educate people about what you can do and what's involved and how, the more you can take perceived risk out of the situation, which means understanding the perceived risk, the
Yes.
higher the chances are in doing that.
Go on
Can I
ahead, Paul.
can I add one thing to that? I'm sorry, Una.
Yeah.
It's just-
No, go for it.
So I don't know if you can read this, but
Yeah.
I think it's a useful thing. And let me just describe it now that you've seen it. There are two dimensions. Draw yourself a matrix, a 2x2 matrix, high skill, low skill, high demand, low demand.
Yeah.
And that'll be a very helpful thing for you as you think about the race to the bottom in pricing.
Yeah.
So,
Very good. Very good.
so here's the implication, if I may just take 1 minute. If it's high demand and you have high skill, name your price.
Yeah.
You have high skill but there's low demand, then the reality is that the top few people are going to get all the opportunity, right? So are you one of those top people? If you have low skill, and that's a competitive thing, and I don't mean to suggest that any of you have low skill, but I do suggest that you all find out whether in the view of the market you do. If you have low skill and it's high demand, you're going to be price pressured, right? So what we know is that writing is an area, for example, copywriting is an area where people feel tremendous pressure to reduce prices because there are so many writers out there. If it's low skill and it's low demand, think about moving into another area of freelancing because it doesn't sound like it's very good. So very important for you folks, for all of us, I'm a freelancer just like you are, to be really clear about where you are in the perceived skill domain, and is the work that you're doing high demand, low demand, or something in between? Because it's gonna be a very useful way for you to figure out whether you're working in the right direction. And for those of you that are low skill in low demand areas, you know the rule about digging. When you're in a hole, stop digging.
Exactly.
Move.
Yeah. Guys, we've probably just got a few minutes left, so I'd like to kind of maybe try and close out on one question you wrote recently, John, about this, the stress that freelancers are under as a result of COVID and reduced income. And I wonder if there are a few things that you might recommend that we all take on board to sort of counter this work stress. I think that would be really helpful.
Sure. I think the first thing is to take to heart some of the things that Paul said. That there's a human on the other side of this, and so you've got to be thinking about this in terms of that other human, not about that thing called kind of corporation. Yeah. That's the first. Second, you really do need to ask yourself, given that matrix. Am I high skill, low skill? Is this a high demand area or a low demand area? Where am I in this? Not as I perceive myself, but as others perceive me, which means you need to get some really good data on how you're perceived and whether you're perceived as a high skill expert person in this area or not. And if you're not, what you're going to do to change that or to move into another area. There's a wonderful fellow named Tal, who's a friend of mine, that talks about the personal hackathon. And I recommend that one of the things that you do is grab a few people, both clients and colleagues and friends, and say, I'm trying to get a real good feeling for where I am in my career, my strengths, my weaknesses, my opportunities, and my threats. Would you give me real feedback?
Yeah.
Third, hunt in packs. Part of the problem with freelancing is that it implies that everybody is sort of on their own, looking on their own. But more and more what we're seeing in these platforms is the idea of a platform not being hub and spokes, but rather being a community of communities. And so more and more, rather than simply inviting individuals onto platforms, people are inviting teams or networks. Not only do you come, but please bring 3 or 4 of your most capable friends. The reason for that is because 4 people hunting is a lot easier than 1 person hunting.
Yeah.
Last point that I was going to make is it's really important as a freelancer that you take control over your fears and anxieties. Part of the problem of being, it was a guy named, I'm trying to remember, Andy Grove used to be the head of Intel many years ago, and Andy Grove wrote this book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And his recommendation, and Paul might get a kick out of this, for folks building a business is, if no matter what you're doing, if you're an effective entrepreneur, you're always terrified. When you're doing well, you're terrified that it's going to end. When you're not doing well, you're terrified that it will never end. And so you've got to take control of that emotion in some way. And the best way to take control of that emotion is to see yourself as an investment. That's a hard thing for people to do sometimes. But your time is the most important investment you have. So are you getting a return on your investment commensurate with what you think is reasonable and fair? And if you're not, it's up to you not to either get a higher rate for that work or to think about doing a different kind of work. But at the end of the day, you have an accountability to do a regular assessment of how business proofed is my business and my business is me. And what do I need to do to make a change if I need to make a change?
That's great advice. And Paul, can I ask you for a sort of a parting piece of advice to all the
You certainly can.
freelancers here?
I don't have the wisdom of John, but I will say one thing. At least
I'm just older than you. That's all. Come on.
What I would say from my own personal perspective, and it's funny when I'm thinking about it, I actually don't come to I don't come to the table going, will I get an agency or a freelance? My starting point is there someone really good that can do the thing I'm trying to get done? And if they turn out to be freelance, that's fine. If they turn out to be an agency, that's fine. It's really not the starting point for me. And I suspect there's a lot of people like that. And when I'm asked regularly, do you know someone who can do X or Y? Yeah, and I don't go, here are some big agencies who can do X or Y, or here are some freelance. I go, here are some names of some people who I think are really good, and some of them work for really big organizations, and some of them work on their own, and some of them work for small boutique agencies. And like, again, I just noticed Aaron's on the call. I've worked with Aaron a couple of times, and he's an incredible director and designer. And if I knew Aaron was available and someone was looking for the kind of thing he's done, that's the guy called Aaron. I don't know where he is at the moment, but this is his name. And so
he's on the indie list.
Yes, he is. Yeah, and anyway, my point is, the purchasing funnel for me is not starting with freelance or agency or consultancy or any of those things. It's like, who's particularly good. And I actually think it is. I think I do. If I reflect on it, I tend to start with people's names, not even with the organization. Yeah. And so that would be my point. And again, if you're good at your craft, and I'd make one last point, is I a lot of the times jobs, as in projects, come up without huge planning in advance. And we
Mm.
do like like everything else, we go to who are the handful of people who might be able to do this, and therefore if you're not top of mind in that
Yeah.
handful, it's you might miss out a chance to get your pitch in. And I do think there's a classic marketing job to be done there.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the job of a solopreneur now, isn't it? Guys, can I say thank you so much to Jon and Paul for your time today, and thank you most especially to the nearly 90 people who joined us for the webinar today. We'd love some feedback on this session. These sessions are for you guys, so please tell us what you want us to do for you that's going to create value and belonging for you guys. And anything that we can do, please, we will be issuing this recording out to everybody, and we'll be trying to kind of pull together the big insights that have come from the great advice here from Jon and Paul. So thank you so much to everybody, and we will be in touch with you again very soon.